actually, the English department here at San Jose State has an Edward Golden contest every year to write the most rambling phrase.
That was the best film last night. Multiverse Dating for Beginners. It was last night they had a short film festival, so it was an hour and a half of short science fiction films. Some were just barely a minute long, and some were longer. That one was was sort of a romantic comedy. With every time she flipped her scarf, she shifted to a different alternate dimension and got to do things over again. And it was very well done. Hey, CD coffee. Got a seat for you.
Do you know what Callahan is?
They should follow.
I mean, the place.
They should have.
No.
Yeah, I see.
Callahan?
Callahan?
Yeah.
What is that?
What are they doing with it? Is it just a place to hang out?
Yeah, no, there's several programs here. So that's where it is.
أيوه
We're
حجزت
down
واحد.
here.
Oh, okay. Yeah.
Oh, it's part of the exhibition.
Yeah. I walked past it yesterday and they had platinum. You got better at
Well, Mr. Niven told me that was going there because they were doing the fun.
Yes.
And I said, well, I do those sometimes, but I don't know what is it, funds for prizes?
No, it's just a punning contest.
Oh.
You get to grow and you're not punning and shit.
Yeah,
Should I read my short story?
no. I don't think they want that long session.
What do you, on the Big Island, what do you call a male Jewish insurance adjuster in Leilani Estates?
Leilani, what?
Estate.
Leilani Estates.
So what's a Leilani estate?
Oh, that's where the right.
Okay, see, I wouldn't have gotten it.
Okay, so what's the bunch?
What is your price boy?
Would anyone in the first row, or second row, first or second row, be willing to give up 3 seats for some differently abled people that have been waiting in the room, or you just got here now and need a place
Got
to
two
sit?
here.
Thank you so much.
I guess you
Well, no. You don't both need to jump up. Thank you very much.
Hello.
Yeah, I went to the other hallway when I remembered, because I was looking at H and not D, and so, but
Yeah, and the program is DH.
yeah.
Right.
Which means it's a combination of E and H.
I assume you
But they're
can come
different
in,
numbers also.
you can come in the back
What happened?
through that door, it's the next hall.
That's why I scouted this out early to see what
But why don't you go get Stan? He's back there. And this side for the back. Like maybe 4 rows from the back.
On your left page. When I went downstairs, I was going to talk to the concierge. And Larry Newman walked up and she was on the phone and he said, well, I was going to ask if there was a shuttle to the convention center. And so I said, well, go ahead in front of me because I'm just going to ask an unimportant question, you know. So he asked them and they said, no, but we were thinking of using our town card today, but we don't guarantee do it.
Is that okay with you now?
And so we got to ride.
So
I looked at this.
Going, getting your right where?
we're at the Hotel de Anza. which is about a half a mile away.
This room does not exercise.
Yesterday I clocked almost 8 miles of walking. The Sci-Fi Short Film Festival was pretty good.
You should have put your skateboard in
Skateboards are awkward. We weren't going to check luggage, you know.
Yeah.
yeah, well, I was gonna check luggage and then everybody in my flight decided to put their bags that were supposed to go under their seats up overhead. We got on last and they took our bags and put them in our carry-on. So severely pared down when we were going to some stuff what we might have taken in the underbelly storage anyway. We had to go down and get baggage claim, pistols on. Another half hour we had to wait for baggage.
Oh, only a half hour. I mean, that's not too bad. Speaking of which, I should probably shut the remote. I don't know why I was speaking of which, but you know, speaking of phone.
But one of the films last night was in Spanish with no subtitles. So you just had to try to figure out from the context from the video what was going on.
That's why you should learn, you know, more.
The thing is, I know enough words. I could. At one point, she has these notes all over her mirror when she gets up in the morning. And one of them I could definitely puzzle out meant parallel universes, and one of them definitely meant nuclear war. And I go,
Guerra,
right, close.
you know, I don't know what they're, but probably very close.
It's very close to nuclear. Yeah.
The thing is that there's so many variations and slang.
Well, I meant just, you know, the basics, things that people, words that people most likely use, you know.
Because you don't change. How could they put it there?
Last night I was at a film concert and the has a new album out, Schrodinger's Herbal.
Did you hear that, Bob?
No, I didn't know.
New film CD out, Schrodinger's Herbal.
Good morning.
No.
Hello, how are you?
Apparently going to be moderating a panel like this. Can you in the back seat?
What is he?
We'll play around with the how's that? In the back, is that okay? Okay, so apparently I think you have to pick it up and hold it.
Yes.
Okay, welcome. This is the Friday 10 a.m. panel, If This, Then What on Alternate History. If you want to be at a different panel, now's your chance to escape. My name is Stephen Silver. Well, if this is down, you put the mic back down.
Why?
Okay, how's that? Okay, it's middling in the back. Can the very back hear me? Okay, I got one thumbs up and I still got another one of these. Okay, so we'll speak loudly as well as using the mics, and probably punch over. So this is If This, Then When, the Alternate History panel. My name is Stephen Silver. I'm the moderator. I'm on this panel partly because I've written alternate history. I've also been the founder and judge and administrator for the Sidewise Award for Alternate History since its founding in 1995. There was something else. Oh, yes, I'm going to be editing an alternate history anthology coming up, hopefully out next year, called Alternate Peace. We'll be launching a Kickstarter for that in about a week. doing that through Zombies Eat Brains. So be on the lookout for that. Zombies are very, they're dead. They're really don't move. They're slow zombies. So now I'm going to let my fellow panelists introduce themselves. We will start at the rear end, right near end with Kaya.
I'm Kaya Folio. I am half of the team that makes the webcomic Girl Genius. We also have, and we also have some novels that are also Girl Genius novels. So theoretically, I guess they're alternate history, but I would say they're extremely alternate history. We mostly make everything up. We throw in some names and places just to make it sound legit, but in fact, we tell a lot of lies.
I'm Justin Bandit. I was born in Spartan Village, Michigan, which makes me a Spartan. And I was in Jedi Son of India, which makes me a Jedi, so I'm a Spartan Jedi. I'm a founder of a self-publishing house called the Tehelon, which means they are imagining. Its objective is to build the sci-fi culture in the Arabian world. I'm on this panel because my first novel, The Yaqlania, is an alternate history, but from an Arabian perspective. We've got free copies on Kindle. You can get them if you want. Tell me what to do. Thanks.
My name is Kate Kenyon, and I have written 3 alternate histories recently from Simon & Schuster called the Dark Talents novels. I guess they're alternate history. They are close cousin of alternate history in that there's definitely a major change in that the 1930s had psi powers, and I investigate the world of espionage if that had been the case. And the 3rd book is coming out next spring. I've also written an alternate history about how the British were kicked out of India in 1857, called 1,000 Perfect Things. And I have an alternate history short story out from Zombies Eat Brains. The anthology is called The Razor's Edge, that explores the difference between being a rebel and being an insurgent. So which side of the establishment are you on, and how do you get defined as being good or bad? And I'm also the founder of the Right on the River organization where I come from, Eastern Washington. And it's a year-round writing organization. And I live in Wenatchee, Washington. I'm very happy to be here.
I'm Harry Turtledove. I am an escaped Byzantine historian who tells lies for a living. Because I have the background I do, a lot of the lies tend to be alternate history. I have the cover story in the brand new FNSF. It's called Powerless. It's set in a communist Southern California and based on the wonderful essay by Václav Havel called The Power of the Powerless. I also have a novel coming out from Tor next month called Through Darkest Europe, set more or less now in an alternate world where Western Europe stagnated culturally due to an overdose of religion, and Islam developed science, technology, and representative government. If I can rationalize it fairly well, I can.
Okay, so because at least 2 of the panelists up here question their own alternate history credentials, I'd actually like to start out with a discussion of what alternate history is and what it means to people. Kyle, I'm going to start aiming this at you a little bit, but everybody's more than welcome to jump in. I think that one reason why people look at Girl Genius as alternate history is because it's steampunk. And steampunk has a feel of alternate history, whether it is or not. So let's start out with, is steampunk alternate history, or is it sometimes alternate history and sometimes not?
I am not going to fight about what steampunk is and isn't. That is not my battle, and I am not on it. In fact, Girl Genius is totally steampunk. steampunk, whatever, but, you know, on the book, we actually say Gasland Fantasy because we do not want to have that fight. That said, the way that Phil and I go about writing the story really is, you know, starting from a standpoint of exactly what the title of this panel is, if this, then what. We, you know, now admittedly, the premise we started with was mad science, let's make it real. All right, if mad science is real and you've got the guy screaming defiance from the castle and building monsters, why are they doing that? What makes a person do that? Why do they think this is a good idea? And through asking ourselves those questions and then running with whatever stupid answers we come up with, that's how we've told the whole story. And in that case, I think alternate history does, and in fact even steampunk, it starts from a kernel of something that is real. You know, something, with steampunk, if you're looking at, wow, I really like the way the Industrial Revolution changed the world, and I want to think about that. When you start thinking about that, and then you start thinking about, well, what if it had gone to its ridiculous extreme, then you end up with a fantasy genre.
Any comments on that, or should we?
Yeah, well, I think to me, alternate history is kind of what she said, but a little bit more specific. So if you just throw an idea out there and don't show the specifics of how that actually happened, how did this extreme industrial revolution happen, and when did that start, does it actually diverge from our history, I would think it's more of a fantasy or science fiction. But if you clearly show what dates and how that happened and what events led to this thing happening, then in my opinion it becomes an alternate history.
I think, you know, one of the reasons that alternate history has become identified with science fiction to some degree is that a lot of the times they do the same kind of thing, except they do it at a different point on the timeline. In most forms of science fiction, you change one thing in the present or in the nearer future, and then you look at how that change ramifies in the more distant future. Okay, in alternate history, you change something in the more distant past and then look at the possible effects that that change will have on the more recent past or the present. So I mean, you're doing the same thing, but you're doing it in a different place on the timeline, and that makes it look a little different. For one thing, very often in science fiction, you're not dealing with real people, you're dealing with people you invent, whereas in alternate history, you're dealing with people who are real, but who are dealing with vastly changed circumstances from the ones that really lived in. So there, you know, there are different things to play with, but the technique is very often similar.
Well, in my view, alternate history is a very interesting continuum from the one end that we're talking about, especially you like to define Harry and you, Yasser, where you actually change historical events. And then there's playing with history where, and you can move all the way over to, there is one thing that's different, but it doesn't change any historical events at all. Like, the whole world may be a secondary world based mainly on our world, and it almost seems like an alternate history, like Michael Moorcock's Gloriana. I don't know if that, you know, it's not really changing. I mean, it's so utterly, what did you call it, extreme alternate history. But I do think it's interesting how, if we're going to stick to this side of the spectrum for a moment, just look at what's really, what is the most typical alternate history. I wonder if you would consider Naomi Novik's Temporary series. I don't know if you have read it, Alternate History, because if a point of departure is one of the things where we're going to define things on the far end of the spectrum, then do we need a point of departure, or can it just be something assumed to have changed? Because, you know, where do dragons come from? That was never said. I mean, but obviously, a major course of history has changed in all of those books. So I mean, you could parse it different ways, but for my work, for example, I consider it more in the middle of the, or to the right of the spectrum, that actual historical events are not changed, but we're playing with daily life, and that's where the reader intersects with the changes.
Yeah, there's very definitely a continuum. And one of the things that we do with the sidewise award every year is the judges, we argue about, where things fall on the continuum and when they fall off of it. If magic exists, is that an alternate history or is it straight fantasy? And I think that there's, depending on the story, there can be a case made for both. Scott Card's Elven Maker series has magic, very definitely an alternate history. You mentioned Naomi Novik's. I do consider it alternate history, but I kind of view it as an alternate history light because I've never been able to figure out what the branch point is. How you get from a common world to where she is, which is essentially the Napoleonic Wars, but with dragons. And every time I try to figure out how you logically get there historically, my brain kind of explodes.
So you want a point of departure, you want a rationalization for how the change happened.
Right. Several years ago, my phone just answered itself.
So your phone called itself and then answered.
No, somebody else called it, but it answered itself. It's actually been ringing a lot while I've been up here, of course. Several years ago, I came up with what I consider a workable definition of alternate history that does include everything on the spectrum, which is that a change has to have happened in the past from when the author was writing. If you're writing about something that's set in 2020, it doesn't all of a sudden become alternate history in 2020 when that doesn't happen.
A point that is often missed, unfortunately.
I've had several arguments with people about that who are telling me that 1984 is alternate history or 2001 is alternate history. And there has to be an intent on the part of the author for it to be alternate history in my mind. The change that happens has to be something that makes a known difference. Otherwise, it's secret history. And you can have a great secret history story, but to me, it's something different from alternate history. And what I mean there is, if the change happened and you follow it through, but history as we know it isn't impacted by it, it's secret history. And that doesn't necessarily mean personal. You can have very personal alternate histories. Two of my favorite examples of personal alternate histories are the movie It's a Wonderful Life and the movie Sliding Doors. Both of them explore alternate history, and actually Wonderful Life does it better because it does show the major ramifications if George Bailey had never existed. And then the third part is, it needs to explore how this change changed the world. An alternate history that ends with the change, to me, is not really an alternate history. You need to follow up on that change, see what happens. And the story itself can be set at the point of the branch and a little bit beyond, or it can be set 200 years beyond the branch, and let you know what the branch is. And it doesn't have to be explicit about the branch, but we should be able to figure out what it is. So that's my definition of alternate history, and it does vary. We'll take questions later. I'd really like people.
It was an interjection.
Okay.
Just to ask, what about a prequel if it's a series?
Probably not. Again, it would depend on the circumstances. Although one of the things I would have really been wanting to do for several years is I want to do an anthology where I invite a whole bunch of authors of fantasy or science fiction who have long-running series to write an alternate history set in their world.
Movies.
Well, they are, they haven't gone back and changed anything, and you can kind of make the case that they tweaked it with the prequels. But for instance, I would love, for instance, to see, just to pull around, George R.R. Martin, if Ned had not been. Has everybody gotten through write a story set in that world in which something from the first book happened very differently.
When I was writing the Timeline 191 books, which began in the 1880s and worked up through World War II, I finally got to 1942 in that series, and my wife said, "You ought to have aliens invade right now just to watch your editor's head explode."
The thought occurred to a lot of people other than Laura.
Steve, I want to challenge you just a little bit on one thing you said, although I just being ornery. You said, and I love these definitions of alternate history. I think they're very, very cogent and easy to understand. But when you say has to change history, do you mean history as dominant culture would define it, like the things that the wars that happened, the big corporate events, the scientific discoveries, things like that, or would you acknowledge that history can also be social change?
Oh, definitely social change. I'm editing an anthology about peaceful change.
Okay.
The idea of alternate peace is where it's not war, it's not violence.
So if it's social change, and might we include some books more in the cousin territory, into alternate history, if the social changes were like gender roles, for instance, and those gender roles are perceived by the reader and through the point of view character as personal, everyday experience of sexism or these kind of things, or would it have to have large ramifications? Like, oh gosh, if women are going to have those roles, then we'll have these huge things that have to happen, or can it be more individual in particular?
In my opinion, it can be very individual in particular. I would like to see an exploration of some of the larger ramifications, but I'm very happy looking at something like what you're describing as considering an alternate history. Of course, that's not a blatant statement. With anything, of course, it depends on how you present it and how you write it and everything.
You know, all right, many years ago, she's 30 years dead now, Anna Russell spoofed grand opera. And Anna Russell famously said, in grand opera, you can do anything as long as you sing it. And that applies pretty much to any kind of artistic endeavor, very much including alternate history. You can do anything as long as you do it well enough, as long as you sing it, as long as you convince the reader and make the reader follow along and want to know what happens next. You can do whatever you jolly well please if you do it well.
Okay, I think one of the things is alternate history, we consider it frequently a subgenre of science fiction. But like science fiction, it has a lot. You have hard science fiction, you have hard alternate history. You have humorous science fiction, you have humorous alternate history. To use one of Harry's books as an example, Harry wrote a novel called The Two Georges with some co-author who I don't think has written anything else since then.
Actually, he has.
Richard Dreyfuss, the actor. And it's a wonderfully fun, great alternate history. But it's set in, the branch point happens during the American Revolution.
Slightly before, actually.
Okay, and it's set more or less in the modern day. And although people's roles have changed, people who are alive in our world are alive, even though if you logically look at it, there's no reason that the same DNA would have merged.
No. So sometimes you need to do that just for fun.
Right, exactly. And to me, like I said, it's a fun book, it's a very enjoyable book. But every time I come across a common name in it, it does drop me out because Harry was putting in these touchdowns. Or Harry and Richard were putting in these touchdowns.
Do include my co-author, because
yes.
The plot is mostly his.
So,
on that point, so in my alternate history, although I logically concluded that I cannot use the same names that existed within that time period because the branching was about 250 years before that point. But what my philosophy is, like all major events and all major characters will still exist, but in a different form, name, or whatever. So that the vibe of these things, the vibe of these people, the essence would still exist somehow in this alternate, but they would definitely not be the same. They would clearly be different.
And I think that's perfectly legitimate. It's actually kind of a steam engine time attitude towards alternate history. When it's steam engine time, steam engines will be created. When it's the right time for a person in this role to exist.
To me, it wasn't just like, it was like more like, for example, in my novel, although the entire history of the United States and America changed, but still somehow there was still a civil war at the same, or somehow there was still the British War and the Tea Party, but in a total different way. It happened, although all the players are different. But these, yeah, so like these events are so huge, they would ripple across not just time, but across multiple timelines.
Yeah, and that's one of the arguments that historians have, let alone alternate historians. You know, is it the great man theory of history? Is it, forces that are beyond our control so that it doesn't matter who the actor is, it's still going to happen? And one of the things alternate history does is it gives us a chance to play around with that and explore it.
Well, I'd like to go back to the point of departure again. I just wonder why you find it so crucial to have a point of departure. I think it's very interesting when it works, but I think everything you write has to serve the story.
Yes.
And there's no point in just proving that you're playing badminton with the net up by forcing in something like that. I mean, somehow.
The trick is writing it in so it's not forced.
Well, right, but suppose you have a story where it seems irrelevant. You just wanted to explore what would happen if society moved a different way. I suppose that would just be a secondary world rather than.
I mean, do you really, if you as an author really have an idea you want to write out, do you really care what people title you, right? Like, these are just sort of academic titling and academic bickering about what is and what is not alternate history. I'll have the same argument with why I say that this is how alternate history is, because my definition of science fiction is a bit different as well. To me, if you can't justify what's happening, okay, then it's not science fiction. To me, Harry Potter is science fiction, while Star Wars is fantasy. Because Star Wars, he just has the power, he just uses the force, and there's no explanation. While Harry Potter, they go to school, they're taught, they're putting in some effort. So to me, one of them is justifiable, the other isn't. So same thing with alternate history. I want to see that you're justifying how these things are happening. And to me, there's an added point on what you said, is that the change has to be possible and logical. So if you say you're going to change something that's so huge and needs so many different people to make that change, it's logically hard to sell to my audience that all these strange things happen coincidentally just so that my alternate happens. So the branching has to happen at a point where it's a very small event that one or two people can make, and then this whole thing changes.
So it can be fantasy. You said it has to be I like to bicker. Okay.
I actually think that it's wonderful that you are challenging our assumptions.
What I think we are doing here is approaching the Supreme Court Justice's definition of porn.
Well, I think it is fun to play around with some of the possibilities of alternate history. For instance, whether to have a point of departure or to have a point of departure named but never explained. I don't know how, are you familiar with, it's an obscure series, but it's wonderful, Jeffrey Barlow's Western Lights. And there is a British settlement on the west coast of the United States, 18th century milieu. And they got there, and that's all there is, just this little pocket on the west coast, and the rest of the world is just kind of unknown. And this all happened because of the sundering, which is, I mean, I read 2 books, and I just never found out about it. It was like, you don't know.
It's some event that triggers everything.
Existential event that triggered everything, and now this is like 200 years in the future, and so there are rumors of sailing ships almost making it from Great Britain, which was actually destroyed in some degree. And so I'm not saying whether it gets to be considered alternate history or not, but he's playing with the idea that, yes, there was a point of departure, but I'm not going into it.
Right, and I mean, to me, the feel in that, for the most part, not all entirely, is post-apocalyptic. It gives more of a post-apocalyptic vibe than an alternate history vibe. And of course, you can combine the two as he does.
I think you don't also necessarily need to have a single branching out point. Like sometimes you have like a branching out point that's 1,000 years ago that you explain that it didn't affect, and you explain why it didn't affect the next 500 years for whatever reason. So like the Transformers crashed into this mountain and they were covered in whatever, and nobody found them. And then the next interjection point would be 500 years later when somebody actually does find this, and therefore you can kind of combine these two to come up with a new branch.
Which actually I'm going to point out another work of Harry's that does that kind of thing. Harry, you've written a lot of alternate history, it seems to me. Harry has a series based about Atlantis. But rather than Atlantis being the sunken island that Plato described, Atlantis is the east coast of the United States that's essentially only half as far.
It rifted off from the rest of the continent 85 million years ago. What touched that one off, sometimes you know exactly where you get an idea. And this is one of the cases where I do, because I was reading a book about the pre-human ecology of New Zealand. And I thought, what would happen if we do that with North America, and where New Zealand had drifted away from Australia? What happens if we do that with North America? What does it look like? I know exactly where that idea came from.
So to get back to Yassir's point, in that particular case, the original branch point is geological and geographical. And the historical branch point, as far as the stories are concerned, is essentially when the Europeans discovered this island in the middle of the Atlantic much earlier than they did in our own timeline.
It's also interesting that a point of departure might not be very specific, but it might be a general trend. And Stephen Barnes' Lion's Blood.
Oh, yes.
This is it's a magnificent alternate history that posits that Islamic culture flourished while Western culture diminished, and it rather than become involved in tribalism or colonialism, Islamic culture and Persian influence hugely flourished, such that they became the rulers of the Western world and colonized Western world. And then there is
It's black slave owners with white slaves.
Yes.
Right? It's a role reversal.
yes, but in this case, it's hard to say that there was a certain twist of time that happened.
It's
so
Steve
those are-
Steve and I've been friends with Steve for 30 years. We've talked about this. So, Steve was working very hard to make this as plausible an alternate history as he possibly could. I don't think it worked as a hardcore alternate history, but I think it works. Hank, let me finish. But I think it works extremely well as a story, and that is, that's more important.
So my alternate history is kind of the same thing. It's like, what if the Andalusian culture somehow survived the Inquisition and then found this continent, and their science continued and flourished because they were already ahead of their times. And how would that Islamic culture look like, influenced by the Native Americans?
Is that very, very similar, but sounds like a wonderful riff on the whole colonialism. And do you go into the colonialism aspect as well?
So yeah, so in my novel, I hypothesize that because actually Christopher Columbus found the Americas just a few months after the fall of Granada. So my theory is that he needed the science that was within Granada to be able to make the trip that he was assuming to take to China. But the Andalusians themselves realized that they had a lost cause, and then they had to flee, and they fled to the Americas, it took that science with them. So Europe never actually found this continent, and they just thrived here for a couple of centuries before somebody decided to come back or to go.
Okay, new question. When deciding what you're going to be writing about for an alternate history, does your process differ if you start with the branch point or if you start with the results? And which do you prefer?
What do you mean by start with? You mean start the story after the period of the branch point?
I'm thinking more in terms of starting your plotting and figuring out what you're going to be
When
writing.
you're actually thinking
You're
about
saying, you know, this might be a really cool branch point. What happens if X happens? Where do we go from there? Or do you start with, I want a world that looks like this. How do I get there? Where do I have to make the change?
I think for me it was more like I chose the branching out point, or tried to choose the branching out point first. To me, it was that point of history has such a huge psychological impact on Arabs and Muslims in general, even though it's 500 years ago. And I thought that's a very important historical point for us to kind of explore. But my original target was I was trying to explore what to do, what would the world look like had Andalusia still survived. But then I found there wasn't a single point where I can make it survive. There wasn't any small event I can change and then Andalusia will still exist. But I found that the easier part was to figure out another way for it to survive by changing who discovered these Americas and how that culture just moved here and thrived on tap for a long period of time.
I began in a very similar way with my book, At the Table of Wolves, which is the first book in this trilogy about Side powers in the 1930s and how it affected World War II. I found that the thing that seemed to influence World War II the most was World War I. And I became fascinated with World War I. And then I started reading about the losses of World War I. And I wanted to explore the psychological impact of that suffering, such that side powers, long suppressed for millennia, except for little bust-outs here and there that were persecuted, broke through because of that great suffering of World War I and the horrendous loss of life, especially from certain countries lost so many young men of their generation. And I think that shadow fell across Europe and affected attitudes that allowed Hitler's regime to be tolerated, if not rise. And so I think when you find these psychological moments that affect cultures so deeply, they can open up avenues of your imagination into a story. And then from there you go, well, then that, then how do these side powers play out, and how does it play out in the context of a suffering that nobody wanted to talk about in the 30s?
Usually, I will work from a great point and try to see what happens. I think most people who write alternate history do that most of the time. We were talking about Steve Barnes' Lions, Blood, and Sequels. I think that's a reverse. I think Steve wanted to have a world with these conditions and try to justify it retroactively. You know.
Well, did justify.
But I think that's much harder. Like, I think once you have an end result, finding the proper branching point that makes sense is much harder.
I would agree with you. I would agree with you, absolutely.
Well, when we were working on Girl Genius, we did start with the result and then thought back to why it would be that way. So it very much was a case of, and keep in mind that my husband and I are primarily cartoonists, and so we think in very goofy cartoon ways. And so saying to ourselves, this is mad science trope, and we love tropes, and we play with tropes. And so to say, well, this trope of the mad scientist, where would that come from? Why would that be? If that were more of a widespread trait, why and where did it come from? And that's a lot of fun. It's a joy to look back and think, for what would be, I don't know about a branching point, because in our case, we thought of it as, well, this is something that is inherent to certain, people who think certain ways, and over history, we would have had people like this, and as human knowledge grows and accumulates, you have more people who are able to do more with what has been learned, until all of a sudden you have a lot of people who can do pretty wild stuff. But it was fun, and for us, that's what it's all about.
Yeah, I've got to say, imagining you and Phil sitting across the kitchen table, pitching ideas back and forth, and trying to justify stuff, is a really great image.
Well, that's how it works. So most of the time, it's a hotel breakfast table, though.
Okay.
Like,
Harry, earlier you talked about how alternate history is similar to science fiction. How does the if this then that process of alternate history differ from writing the if that this then that process in writing science fiction? And I know you've written both. Kay, you've written both.
Well, for me, the big difference is that when you were writing regular science fiction set in the future, or when you're writing fantasy, I also have written a lot of historically based fantasy, you're projecting onto a blank screen. People only know about what you tell them of the world that you're building. Whereas when you're writing alternate history, very often people will have their own ideas about what Abraham Lincoln was like, what Robert E. Lee was like, and you have to make these characters, I'm just using a couple of examples, but I mean, this kind of issue crops up whenever you write alternate history, and wherever your breakpoint is. You have to make these characters and their responses in the new conditions persuasive to the reader who already knows something about people and the circumstances. You say American Civil War, all of you out there are going to have some sort of thoughts that come to mind about the American Civil War. You already know stuff about it, and you have to decide when you're reading a story by one of us, whether what we're saying about what would have happened if the Civil War had gone differently or hadn't happened or whatever, is that plausible? Does that accord with what I already understand? And I think that's what makes alternate history challenging and fun, because it can give you a way to look at the world through a funhouse mirror that you can't get in a young world.
I also think that it's not for the faint of heart, because you're always a bit swimming upstream with alternate history, against the stream, because of what Harry was talking about. And then I've seen in some alternate histories where it becomes a desperate match to the death, because you're trying so hard to prove concept that you're weighing down the story with a lot of detail, and with any world building, and you could call alternate history the world building extreme. That the key is what to include, and that means you leave most of it out. But I don't like to see a story so weighed down in world building that the human story is totally lost. And you don't have room in most books to do both extensively. Oh, please.
It's at this, this applies to alternate history in particular, but it applies to writing in general. It's like an iceberg. You show maybe 10% of what you know, and by what you show, you imply that you know all the other stuff. For me, the classic example of this, and although it has nothing whatsoever to do with alternate history, it's a creative world, is Tolkien. Tolkien, there's stuff bubbling up in the Lord of the Rings that happened thousands of years before he's talking about. but you know perfectly well by what he does tell you that you could ask him anything about what happened in those thousands of years, and he would know the answer like that. And that's the impression that you want to try to create.
Let me riff on that. I think that's a fabulous metaphor, and you know, the reason it's so successful for the reader to skate on some things and not say too much is that isn't that like the real world? I mean, we're always in partial knowledge. We're also only in command of certain facts in certain contexts. And so we're always walking through a dark forest. And when you are in a book that is very convincing in certain telling details, but lets the rest skate away from you, that feels like familiar territory.
I think the other thing about like science fiction and alternate history, in science fiction, as you said, you kind of have your original base, which is what we know today, and then you kind of build the entire structure on top of it. With alternate history, you kind of have all this entire building, and you start smashing through it and rebuilding parts. But it's much harder because you don't want to smash out the entire thing, otherwise you're going to have to build the entire thing again. And to make sure that whatever you're building actually fits within the place you broke it off is kind of weird, and sometimes you're just going to see all of these cracks and all these joints that didn't really match up. But I think also alternate history on the flip side is a very interesting learning tool for people who want to learn about history. So I've actually argued several times that if you really want kids in a history class to really learn about history, ask them to do alternate histories about the period you're teaching them on, because then they'll really understand how history works and what these different characters actually meant within that history and what their impacts were. And they would be engaged much more than just giving them all these different historical facts.
Yeah, in college I was taking a class in the Mongol conquest, and the assignment that we were given was write an essay. If you could take one thing back to the time of the Mongol conquest and introduce it, and it had to be something that you could a single person could carry and that was self-contained, what would you bring back and describe how it would change Mongol civilization? And it was a really fun assignment.
Is that what got you into alternate history?
No, I was a historian. I tried to be a historian, and I was also a science fiction fan. And when you put those two together, that said, we actually only have about 5 to 8 minutes left, so I am going to open up the floor for questions. Right here first.
I just wanted to contribute a term that I think you've been searching for, which is simply alternate reality, which can be the same thing, except the reason for the difference is not important to the story. The author just doesn't spend time talking about it.
It's a possibility. I think a lot of times you wind up more with secondary world stories, secret histories in some cases. I mean, honestly, The Girl Genius, I personally would not really qualify that as alternate history. It occupies its own little mythological niche, and you can kind of place and see where it belongs.
As long as I get to do what I want, I'm not going to fight that.
Okay, downstream from your breakpoint, if you're dealing with a civilization that, say, we're not as familiar with as North Americans, you know, and the attitudes are different than they would have been otherwise. You know, say like you have an Islamic civilization. An Islamic reader can pick up the differences and the nuances, you know, but how do you make that clear to, say, an American reader?
Well, I think that's kind of okay. Yes, the question is, when you have an alternate history and downstream from the breakpoint, the suppositions and the attitudes of the characters are very different, and you're dealing in one culture. He specifically chose Islam. How do you make the changes and differences clear to somebody who's not part of that culture?
So I kind of learned that the hard way, but before I did my novel. So our publishing house, the first novel we published was titled Hogan. It's written by my partner, and it was an overnight bestseller. Actually, on the month we launched it in Saudi Arabia, it was the #1 selling book, and then the #2 was Dan Brown's Inferno. Then we decided we wanted to translate that to English, and well, I translated it to English. I'm dual citizen, I'm a dual cultured, I thought. And then before we published it, I gave it off to a few of my friends in different English-speaking parts of the world. And half of them just came back to me halfway through and they're like, we have no clue what the hell is going on with this stuff. So then I realized that translation is not just about words, it's about all the cultural gaps that you have to fill in. And so that's kind of what I tried to make sure to do when I wrote my novel 18 years. I tried to be very conscious about all the cultural gaps that might exist and try to either fill them out through the story or fill them out in a different way. And you know, thinking I was a bit, I took an easier route where I merged them with Native Americans, which most people have some kind of idea what they think they are. And therefore, showing the difference on the natives, okay, was much easier to show and for you to understand what's going on than trying to show the changes on the Islamic world.
Okay.
Right here in the front.
I mean, history itself has its own gaps. With historians, even they have some problems with not knowing what happened at certain time. So how can you overcome that, and how historians usually deal with you? Are they accepting you, or are they attacking you?
Okay, the question is, how do you overcome the gaps in what's known about history? And you know, how does that play with historians themselves?
My favorite magazine that I get is the BBC's History Magazine, and they have actually, because the BBC puts out so many dramas based on history, they talk about this once in a while. So this isn't something to do with me, but I've seen them discuss exactly that point. And some history, it really is a mixed bag, because all historians are individual people just like everybody else. Some of them say, hooray, it gets people interested in history, and they want to read it, and other people are just like, oh God, what are you doing to us? Stop it. And so it apparently causes some people physical pain, and other people are like, hooray, people actually care about my classes now.
Also, a lot of those gaps, that's where you find the story.
Yeah.
You get to fill in those gaps.
The other thing is that historians play with this stuff too these days. That there are things called counterfactuals. And counterfactuals are games historians play. What they are is they're alternate history without characterization. And if you happen to feel like reading academic prose, then you get off on that. And if you don't, then you find alternate history told as a story with people more exciting. And I mean, I play academic games and I would rather not.
Although I will point out that last year we did give a counterfactual a Sidewise Award. I think it was last year.
It can happen. I mean, you know, the one that immediately springs to mind, of course, is For Want of a Name.
Which also has a Sidewise.
Yeah, and deserves it, you know, which is a college history level textbook complete with critical apparatus and citations of non-existent scholarly books in a world where North American history ran very, very differently from the way it really did. God only knows how someone got that published, but he did.
Unfortunately, we are now out of time. We have the room for a few more moments. You can come up and talk to us. Feel free. I want to thank my panelists for 211C. Giving out the Sidewise Awards for alternate history because I have a whole hour to give out two claps. I'm going to torture the nominees who are there, which include Harry, Alan Smale, Greg Bedford is here, I think Bryce Dable might be coming.
I think Bryce is coming. Before everybody leaves, my book is free on Kindle.
Before we give up the awards, I'm going to continue this conversation at that time.
And if anyone has a birthday in August, meet me outside the door, giving away some free books.
Yeah, I don't think the Sidewise Awards are
Thank you.